She worked in a pleasure house. She was granted more freedom than most because of who she was. And because rich men paid more to a woman with silver hair. She used to tell me I was no different to her brother's boys, Viserys and Daemon, but I was ashamed of her. This one piece of dialogue tells us everything about Hugh the Hammer, his whole backstory, and where he sits in the Targaryen family tree. I was no different to her brother's boys, Viserys and Daemon, makes Hugh their first cousin. Only one Targaryen princess has ever worked in a pleasure house in this era. One of the old King Jaehaerys' troublesome daughters, the Princess Saera Targaryen. The old king did an amazing job ruling the Seven Kingdoms with his sister queen, but his home life was riddled with some extreme drama. A lot of their 13 children had a rebellious nature mixed in with their character. Saying that Saera was granted more freedom than most is the understatement of the week. She lived like royalty after escaping her father's control. There's still a chance she's still alive and kicking too. Saera would be 62 years old at the time the Civil War kicks off. She ran too far away from King's Landing to know how her life ended in the lore books. But before I get into her insane life and where Hugh fits into the chaos, I should say Hugh and Ulf never mentioned their ancestry in the books. Ulf is a drunk who would loudly boast where his seed came from if he knew it. The last episode only told us he isn't sure he has Targaryen blood at all. He just had the right hair color to get free drinks from inns and taverns. I thought Hugh was going to turn out to be Viserys and Daemon's half-brother, since their father Balon lived a pretty long life after his sister wife passed. That backstory could still be given to Ulf. But if they didn't mention it in the episode where he gets the spotlight, I don't think we're ever going to get a clear answer, which is fine. Because it's realistic that his Dragonlord blood likely came from many generations back through another whorehouse or a minor Targaryen sleeping around on Dragonstone. As for Hugh the Hammer, him bonding with Vermithor is very cyclical. His grandfather, the Old King, was deeply ashamed of his daughter Saera, just like how Hugh hates thinking of his embarrassing origin. If you don't know, the Old King Jaehaerys was Vermithor's only other rider. And I think it carries a bit of his personality. The show's version of Hugh is shaping up to be taking after his grandfather, much more than his mother. Princess Saera was a trial from the very start. Tempestuous, demanding, disobedient. The first word she spoke was no, and she said it often and loudly. She refused to be weaned until past the age of 4, even as she ran about the castle, talking more than her siblings Vaegon and Daella combined. She wanted her mother's milk, and raged and screamed whenever the queen dismissed another wet nurse. "Seven save us," Alicent whispered to the king one night. Fierce and stubborn, Saera Targaryen thrived upon attention and sulked when she did not receive it. Their 9th-born child, the Princess Saera, with a ferocious hunger for milk, for food, for affection, for praise. As a babe, she did not so much cry as scream, and her ear-piercing wails became the terror of every maid in the Red Keep. She wants what she wants, and she wants it now. Grand Maester Elisar roared the princess in 69 AC when she was only 2. Seven save us all when she is older. The Dragon Keepers had best lock up the dragons. He had no notion how prophetic those words would be. Septon Barth was more reflective as he observed the princess at the age of 12 in 79 AC. She is the king's daughter and well aware of it. Servants see to her every need, though not always as quickly as she might like. Great lords and handsome knights show her every courtesy. The ladies at court defer to her. Girls of her own age vie with one another to be her friends. All of this Saera takes as her due. If she were the king's firstborn, or better, his only child, she would be well content. Instead, she finds herself the 9th-born, with 6 living siblings who are older than her, and even more adorned. Such a fierce little thing she is, they say. She has no need of comfort. They are wrong in that, I fear. All men need comfort. So, Saera had a real bad case of the middle child syndrome. Her initial way of lashing out was pranks, mischief, with a sprinkle of acts of malice. She regularly pestered her own cowardice sister, the Princess Daella, who happens to be the Queen Aemma's mother. Then, when Saera was 12, she started arriving drunk when summoned to the Sept for prayer. The king's half-witted fool was her main victim. I would call the cruel things she did to him as psychological torture. It was bad. From convincing him to get naked, to talking him to sitting on the Iron Throne, all the while injuring himself on all the blades. She's an evil child, her Septa said of her afterward. This is not to say that the princess was without her virtues. Her maesters affirmed that she was very clever, as bright as her brother Vaegon in her own way. She was certainly pretty, taller than her sister Daella, and not half so delicate, and as strong and quick and as spirited as her sister Alyssa. When she wanted to be charming, it was hard to resist her. Saera had learned the art of getting anything she wanted from her father. A kitten, a hound, a pony, a hawk, a horse. Jaehaerys did draw a firm line at the elephant. Queen Alysanne was far less gullible, however. And Septon Barth tells us that Saera's sisters all misliked her to a various degree. At 14, she told the king she meant to marry the Prince of Dorne, or perhaps the king beyond the wall so she could be queen like mother. That year, a traitor from the Summer Islands came to court. Far from shrieking at the sight of him as Dayla had, Sarah said she might like to marry him too. By 15, she had put such idle fantasies aside. Why dream of distant monarchs when she could have as many squires, knights, and likely lords as she desired? And when her antics became public, and she got those knights and lords who flocked to her that went in dungeons, the old king and good Queen Alysanne thought placing servants around her at all times was enough to keep her from getting out of control. But all Sarah had to do was order them away. If the servants saw anything that could get the troublesome group into trouble, they would threaten to have the servants' tongues removed if they snitched. The king and queen questioned her seriously when Sarah got her noble teenage knights thrown into dungeons. She admitted to sleeping with all 3 of them, and the Red Keep has no secrets. She was spoiled goods. Jaehaerys was so horrified he could not speak, but the queen kept her composure. "I will be married," the princess said. "Why shouldn't I? I could marry all 3 of them. Why not? Why should I have just one husband? The Conqueror had 2 wives, and Maegor had 6 or 8. She had gone too far. Jaehaerys rose to his feet and descended from the Iron Throne, his face a mask of rage. "You would compare yourself to Maegor? Is that who you aspire to be?" His Grace had heard enough. "Take her back to her bedchamber," he told his guards, "and keep her there until I send for her again." When the princess heard his words, she rushed toward him crying, "Father, father." But Jaehaerys turned his back on her. She would not go on her own accord, so the guards were forced to drag her from the hall, wailing and sobbing and calling for her father. That very night, Princess Sarah sealed her fate. Instead of remaining in her rooms as she had been instructed, she slipped away whilst visiting the privy, donned a washerwoman's robes, stole a horse from the stables, and escaped the castle. She got halfway across the city to the hill of Visenya, but as she tried to enter the dragon pit, she was found and taken by the dragon keepers and returned to the Red Keep. Good Queen Alysanne wept when she heard, for she knew her cause was hopeless. Jaehaerys was hard as stone. Sayera with a dragon was all he had to say. Would she have taken Balerion as well, I wonder? This time the princess was not allowed to return to her own chambers. She was confined to a tower cell instead. King Jaehaerys took his anger out on a noble knight in the dungeon that she slept with. The king coerced a character named Sir Braxton Beesbury, aka Stinger, into demanding a trial by combat. He was by all accounts an arrogant young man, and sure of his skill at arms. He looked at the 7 Kingsguards standing beneath the Iron Throne in their long white cloaks and shining scale and said, "Which one of these old men do you mean for me to fight?" "This old man," announced Jaehaerys Targaryen, "the one whose daughter you seduced and despoiled." The heir to Honeyholt was 19 years of age, the king 49, but still far from an old man. Beesbury armed himself with a Morning Star, thinking mayhaps Jaehaerys would be less accustomed to defending himself against that weapon. The king bore Blackfire. Both men were well armed and carried shields. When the combat began, Stinger rushed hard at his grace, seeking to overwhelm him with the speed and strength of youth, making the spiked ball whirl and dance and sing. Jaehaerys took every blow on his shield, however, contenting himself with defense, whilst the younger man wore himself out. Soon enough, the time arrived when Braxton Beesbury could scarce lift his arm, and then the king moved to the attack. Even the best of mail is hard-pressed to turn Valyrian steel, and Jaehaerys knew where every weak point could be found. Stinger was bleeding from half a dozen wounds when he finally fell. Jaehaerys kicked his shattered shield away, opened the visor helm, laid Blackfire's point against his eye, and drove it deep. Princess Sarah was sent over to the Faith as punishment. She would be with the Silent Sisters in Old Town, but of course, she escaped. A year and a half later, when her chance came in 85 AC, she seized it, fleeing from the mother house in the dead of the night and making her way down to the docks. No one knew where she went. The truth did not come out until a year later, when a former princess was seen in a Lycene pleasure garden. Queen Alysanne wept to hear it. "They have made our daughter into a whore," she said. "She always was," the king replied. That line hits hard. The years had taken its toll on him, and those who knew him well said that he was never the same after his daughter Sarah had disgraced him and abandoned him. He had grown thinner, almost gaunt, and there was more grey than gold in his beard now. For the first time, men were calling him the Old King rather than the Conciliator. Hugh being one of Sarah's bastards is breaking news to us, but we already knew of at least 3 others, who came to King's Landing during the Great Council of 101 AC, in the very face of the Old King. Each one of these bastards were fathered by a different man. One of her bastard sons was said to be the very image of Jaehaerys in his youth. They were some of the first to be tossed out of contention against Viserys in the vote. Sarah herself, though only 34, decided not to press her own claim, boasting she had her own kingdom in Volantis. That's where she started her own pleasure house. She became very infamous, but also very wealthy. She was dead to Jaehaerys, and the letters Alysanne sent her secretly from time to time all went unanswered. A lot of this lore just wouldn't make a lot of sense to apply to House the Dragon, especially since Hugh in the books knows his blacksmith father, and has no idea which customer fathered him in the show. And just like that, every dragon in the Targaryen's possession has found a rider. Only the 3 wild ones remain.